Kevin McGarry, your masterclass professor, prognosticator of Y'all Woked Up University here. I have the distinct pleasure of having a distinguished gentleman to join me. He is really, in my opinion, a national treasure. He's done a wonderful work uncovering Darwin and Darwin's work. I don't know if you guys could see that, but it's actually Darwinian Racism by Richard Weikart. And he talks about Darwin and all of his horrible kind of atrocities that he really unleashed on all of humanity by virtue of his, his whatever. And so Dr. Richard, I'm going to call him Richard. Richard is here with me, and I just want to thank you, Richard, for joining me on this special podcast that we're going to just uncover Darwin and just through your eyes. I will also mention before I get started that that my book, Woked Up, finally putting an axe to the taproot of white supremacy and racism, was also a lot of attribution for Dr. Richard's work goes to that book. That book would not be the same without his incredible research, his articles that he's written all over the place about Darwin. And I'm just gratified, thankful that you've been able to join me today, Richard. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Kevin.
All right. Well, what's incredible for me is that it seems like everyone has been raised under the sort of auspices of Darwin being this perennial figure of science and of evolutionary theory and everything else. And it's so infused in all of our generations, and K through 16, we are learning aspects of Darwinian theories and aspects of Darwin. And I guess the first question is Darwin is really inescapable, isn't he? I mean, as it relates to academia.
Oh, yeah, sure. I in fact, minored in biology. My major was history. Now I'm a historian, and I'm looking at the history of Darwinism in my work. But I minored in biology, and of course, all my professors were towed the line with Darwinism and evolution and such. To be honest, I didn't really make a fuss about it as an undergraduate, but I never really swallowed it either. It didn't really make a lot of sense to me that all these changes could come about through chance processes. It's just didn't, it never made any sense to me. In fact, I've been telling people recently that I remember back in my high school days, I actually did a bunch of studies of creation versus evolution and such. And I read both sides. I read the evolutionists, I read some creationists and such. And this was back in the 1970s. And I remember reading an article by Isaac Asimov, who was a famous science fiction writer and very pro-Darwinian. And he had this one article where he was talking about how, evolution was just impossible. And he goes on and in this one paragraph talking about how it's just impossible this could have happened. But then the closing line of the sentence was, but here we are, the product of this process, so it's like he thinks there's no other possible alternative. So, that's got to be the way it is. So I think that's where a lot of people come down, by the way, in it, is that they think there's no really other alternative, so it has to be, it's the only game in town for a lot of people.
Yeah, I've read a statistic that says upwards of 90+% of all science doctors included are hold to the Darwinian mindset of evolution, upwards of 90%. Do you think it's that high?
Well, probably among the card-carrying biologists, it may be that high. But of course, there's some things that skew that statistic. That is that a lot of people who don't toe that line aren't going to make themselves known for professional reasons because they know they'll get ostracized if they do. In fact, I know some biologists who may embrace some elements of Darwinian evolution, but not all of it. But they don't really. It doesn't matter in the research that they do, and it doesn't really have an impact on the things that they're doing, so they just ignore it there. So I think, in card-carrying biology probably did, but that's in part self-selecting, though, because people who don't agree with Darwinian biology aren't going to go into that field. In fact, it's one of the reasons I didn't go into become a biologist. I told you I minored in biology. I actually thought about going into biology as my major field. One of the reasons I didn't was because I didn't want to deal with the Darwinian issue and the knowing that the professional impacts that would have on me when people found out I didn't believe in Darwinism and such. There's a self-selection process that goes on. If you don't believe in Darwinism, you're not welcome at the table, and so you don't feel welcome, and so you don't go that way. So there's a lot more people, a lot more scientists who are involved in physics or chemistry, or especially in engineering. There's a lot of Christian who are involved in engineering who reject Darwinism because they realize in engineering it doesn't really make sense. You can't get these, finely tuned instruments, in these biological organisms just by chance. It doesn't work that way. That's not how they do their engineering. They do it by intelligent design. And so they realize that this is what has to take place for biological organisms to become like that as well.
Yeah. Now, you wrote this incredible book about Darwinian racism. And so what was the motivation behind that? What was what started you down that path? Why did you really look intently at Darwin and his impact on racism?
Well, I actually began investigating the history of Darwinism during my graduate school days, and it happened in some sense by accident in that I was going to the University of Iowa working on my PhD, and the professor that I wanted to study under told me that he was going to be going to the University of Virginia so that I couldn't do my dissertation under him. But he said, there's this other professor who does the history of science, that does the history of German science, and you probably ought to work under him. So I started thinking, well, what could I do on the history of science? I was interested in European intellectual history. So what could I do in relation to history of science? And I'd been interested in Darwinism for a long time. I hadn't really done much with it at that point in my life. But I thought that sounds like it might be an interesting thing to approach. And, this professor I'm studying under is a historian of science. So, maybe that might be something to work on. So what I ended up doing is I read some works on the history of Darwinism in Germany, and I decided to do a history for my dissertation. That is, I decided to do a history of the reception of Darwinism by German socialists in the late 19th century. So I had a chapter on Karl Marx, on Friedrich Engels, on other of the famous socialist thinkers in Germany in the late 19th century. And as I was doing that project, I started noticing that there were a lot of Darwinists in Germany that I was coming across who were trying to replace Judeo-Christian ethics with evolutionary ethics. And that's what got me interested in the issue of evolutionary ethics. And so I decided to do my second major research project after my dissertation on evolutionary ethics in the German scene. And as I began doing that project, I started finding out that a lot of the people who were pushing evolutionary ethics were also pushing eugenics, euthanasia, and scientific racism. And so that became one of the key issues. So my book that came out of that research project in 2004 was called From Darwin to Hitler: Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany. And so from there, I've been building upon that and looking at issues relating to eugenics, euthanasia, and also scientific racism and its relationship to Darwinism.
That is a fascinating sort of pathway that you had there to get involved in really looking more intently at Darwin and his history. What do you think is the most troubling aspects of Darwin and his philosophies? Let's say outside of the scientific evolution part, but really more on the racism part. What was the most sort of illuminating and like, wow, this is really bad?
Yeah, well, there's really two key issues that it seemed to me are very pivotal. And one of them is the issue of race. I'll get to that in a second. But another key issue that struck me, not just in Darwin's work, but also in the work of some of the other German Darwinists, and then also some more contemporary philosophers too, like Peter Singer and others like him, is the idea that Darwinism undermines the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic, thus that humans, because we're just the product of chance events over billions of years, that therefore human life really doesn't have any significant value. There's nothing that gives it any value for just a part of this material processes. So that's a very crucial point. And that also connects with the racist issue, because when they start talking about biological inequalities, which they do quite frequently, and racial inequalities is one of the biggest ones that they focus on, they don't think that different peoples have the same value. So once you've undermined the notion that humans have value, then it becomes basically your own opinion or whatever, your own subjective notions of, who is valuable and who isn't. And in the Darwinian scene in the 19th century, race was a crucial issue there. Darwin himself not only believed that races had evolved to different levels. He thought that, in fact, was an evidence for his theory, because he thought there were all these different variations that had taken place in the human species. So he thought that was evidence for human evolution. But he also thought that they were locked in this competition, the struggle for existence. And so he thought that racial extermination, and he uses that term, by the way, racial extermination. He thought that racial extermination was leading to a higher evolution of the human species, and in the way he was seeing it work itself out, of course, was the Europeans going out around the world, colonizing other areas and wiping out indigenous populations. And so Darwin thought that was actually a beneficial process.
He thought that racial extermination was really literally a beneficial process.
Yes, indeed. He thought it was leading to, because he thought that the Europeans were more intellectually capable. He thought that they were also had higher morality. He actually thought there were different moral levels within the racial hierarchies that he spun out too. So he thought that Black Africans and Australian Aborigines and American Indians and such, he thought that they all had they were at different moral levels too than Europeans. And he thought that, ironically, he thought that Europeans had the highest moral level, as of course they're going out exterminating all these other peoples, so it's kind of, there's this irony. And by the way, that's in a lot of my scholarship, I've pointed out that Hitler built upon some of these ideas. Not that Darwin's ideas were the same as Hitler's, they weren't, but Hitler built upon some of these ideas and took some of these ideas like that, and saying that, yeah, this is going to lead us to a higher level as what he called the Aryan race. Darwin doesn't use the term Aryan or anything like that. He just talks about the Europeans. But as the Aryan race goes out and exterminates other races, that this then leads us to a higher level, because he thought the Aryan race was supreme and superior and more intellectually capable and more hardworking and had all these positive moral traits too. Well, Darwin did also believe that there was different moral traits, and he thought that the Europeans had higher moral traits than other races.
Wow. And that is shocking for a lot of people. That's what I brought out in my book as well. Mm-hmm. But when you combine that with he working with his younger cousin, Francis Galton, in initiating eugenics, which means well-born, that is a whole nother, issue.
Yeah, eugenics did come about through Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin. As he was reading The Origin of Species, he became convinced of Darwin's position that there are these variations that take place and that species can change over time. And so he thought, well, maybe we should start trying to take control of our own evolution. And that's really what the eugenics project was all about in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was trying to take control of evolution and to evolve us to higher levels. And so the way they tried to do that was by trying to take control of human reproduction and getting the people who they considered more fit or higher in the evolutionary scale to reproduce more prolifically, and then to hinder people from reproducing whom they considered unfit, or and they use those terminologies, unfit, or, and sometimes they used terms like noxious weeds and other things too. They called some of these people, they used some pretty horrible language for some of these people as well. But they wanted to control the reproduction, so they introduced things like by the early 20th century, they introduced things like compulsory sterilization, which, by the way, the United States was the first place to introduce that. The state of Indiana in 1907 introduced compulsory sterilization. And then later on, they were going to introduce other measures. The Nazis were going to build upon those ideas and introduce killing of people who are disabled in a pretty massive program as well. So these eugenics ideas were ideas of trying to advance the human race in the evolutionary process.
So to our woke minions out there today that really extol and really embrace Darwinism, Darwin, all of his works, and while at the same time they're castigating really innocent people because they happen to believe different than what they believe, as white supremacist, racist, privileged, all of these other types of tropes that they roll out. Do you think that they know that a lot of their embrace of Darwinism and his philosophies, and especially those by virtue, sort of carry through by virtue of Marx and that, do you think they understand the history and the background, that this is all, rooted in racism? I mean, no one could hear what you just said about Darwin and his ideas about getting rid of the unfit and, racial extermination and all of these types of things, actually not say that Darwin was not racist. I mean, clearly he was racist and he was white supremacist if he extolled, Europeans, Aryans, Caucasians, whatever you want to call it. So do you think the woke minions really understand these aspects of Darwinism?
Many of them don't, of course. Many historians of science understand it, but then they will always say, well, everyone else in the 19th century was also racist too. They'll sort of use that as the excuse for Darwin and others. Although, interestingly, Darwin was going to be actually more racist than a lot of his contemporaries, and not everyone was racist. It's true that there was a lot of racism, and most Europeans were racist at the time. That is true, but not everyone was. I mean, David Livingstone, for example, the famous missionary explorer of Africa, he was not a racist. He was loved by the Africans, and he loved the Africans where he was, and he tried to help them and benefit them in whatever ways he could. He tried to elevate them, and he believed in elevating them, and that they could come to the same standards as the Europeans if you just gave them the right education and helped them and such. So not everyone was racist during the 19th century, but Darwin was going to actually bring racism to a higher level than before. And actually, by the 1890s, racism was going to be even more intense, largely because of so-called scientific racism. By the 1890s, Darwin's position about the races had pretty much won the day among scientists. Anthropologists, biologists in the 1890s and early 1900s were overwhelmingly racist and argued that Black Africans were inferior intellectually. They had these racial hierarchies they were drawing. If you look at biology textbooks, in the early 20th century, they were teaching this kind of thing, to people as biological, and they considered it a biological fact. And what's interesting too is that at the time, say in the early 1900s, 19 teens and such, a lot of the people pushing this scientific racism were claiming that anyone who opposed their position, especially Catholics and others who, talked about humans being created in the image of God and such, and Protestants too, more conservative Protestants, anyone talking about, humans being created in the image of God and thus being equal and stuff, they thought that was just a bunch of religious obscurantism, and they thought it was a superstition and things like that. And they thought what's scientific is this racial inequality. And so, so racial inequality was being taught as a scientific fact, really, in the early 20th century by anthropologists and biologists. And they were scorning people who dared to think that humans might be equal.
Wow. Do you think that the doctors and scientists in the science communities today, while they attempt to be woke and in with culture, because they have all of these schemes. Some hospitals say that we're going to provide, sort of priority of your medical needs based upon skin color and some of these things that are going on right now. Do you think that do you think that they embrace Darwinism and at the same time wokeism, and actually don't see the connection between the absolute racism of the theories and theologies that they embrace as a doctor or as a scientist?
Well, they tend to say that Darwin got it wrong on the race, but he got it right on the other things. And they think that science has advanced beyond that. And that seems to be always the answer, by the way, whenever you point out anything where the scientists got things wrong in the past, is, well, that's the past and we've got it right now. We couldn't be wrong now. There's this kind of this hubris, this arrogance, about some, not all scientists, but about some scientists that, people in the past may have messed up about this and that, but now we've got it right. And that seems to be the line that they tend to come at today. So today they point things like they'll look at the genetics and say, look, the genetic makeup of Black Africans and Europeans is not really that much different. There's only a few small differences, and they'll point to these different kinds of things like that. And they'll say, see, so biology doesn't really, evolution doesn't really show there being these strong differences racially. But interestingly, there are a few voices out there. Usually they're marginalized in the biological community, although there's some that, like James Watson, who actually has expressed racism at times. He's one of the people that co-discovered the DNA helix model back in the 1950s. And James Watson at times has made clear that he thinks that Black Africans are inferior intellectually, for example. He doesn't say it very often because he gets a lot of pushback from other biologists. But so there are a few people out there. Again, he's kind of marginalized, however. But there are other people, and this is where what I talk about in my book, Darwinian Racism, in the last chapter. There are people pushing these kind of ideas still today, and using Darwinism as the basis for that. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand when they start talking about white supremacy. A lot of times, if you look at a lot of the scholarship that's being done by professors and historians and religious studies scholars and things like that, or if you listen to NPR, National Public Radio, when they're talking about white supremacy, usually they will draw the link between evangelical Christianity and white supremacy, and they'll blame white supremacy on evangelical Christianity. Now, I don't want to deny that there has been plenty of racism in circles that call themselves Christian. We don't want to deny that. That's true. And we as Christians need to repent of that and move away from that racism. But on the other hand, by the way, there was also, especially in the middle of the 20th century, there were a lot of evangelicals like Billy Graham and others who were pushing against racism too, in a very strong way. And people forget about that too. But the other thing they don't look at is they don't actually look at the writings of these people that call themselves white supremacists, or sometimes they call themselves alt-right, or sometimes they call themselves neo-Nazis. If you look at their writings, and I did this extensively for my book, you look at their websites, you look at the things that they're saying about their own ideology, what they say is that very often they're relying on Darwin, not on evangelical Christianity. And many of them don't even consider themselves Christians at all. And many of them are even anti-religious. There's a lot of them are Nietzscheans, God is dead kind of stuff. And they sort of blend Nietzsche with Darwin in certain ways. In fact, there's a really interesting and horrifying book called Might is Right that was published in the 1890s originally, but it's made a resurgence since the 1970s. Interestingly, it was through the Anton LaVey, who's the founder of the Church of Satan. Exactly. Anton LaVey actually popularized this book, Might is Right. And if you read the book Might is Right, which I was horrified to find was actually on my university library bookshelf, so I got a hold of a copy of it and read it. It's Nietzschean on the one hand and Darwinian on the other hand. And in fact, the subtitle of the book is Survival of the Fittest. So it's got this Darwinian
Wow.
theme meshed all the way through it, talking, and he refers to Darwin forthrightly. This is not just, you know, my reading into him or something like that. He actually talks about Darwin, quotes Darwin in this book
Wow.
and such. He also talks extensively about Nietzsche and his love for Nietzsche and the will to power and other kinds of things like that. So this book, Might is Right, which, by the way, is recommended on a lot of white supremacist websites, and was also recommended by the guy who in 2019 shot up the Gilroy Garlic Festival. In his social media post,
Yeah.
he said everyone ought to read Might is Right.
Yeah. Can I
that
put you,
book
can
is,
I,
yeah, go
can I
ahead.
pause
Sorry.
you for 1 second? Because
Sure.
I want to lead into this, what you're about to say. It's very, very important. For all of you listeners out there and you podcast reviewers, please listen to this. This part of Dr. Weikart's book was especially compelling because, and it's the last chapter, but he draws he factually draws in then white supremacy and mass shootings, and who really seems to be the primary motivators during these mass shootings. And so let's listen to this intently, because I think this will help clear up some of the, oh, you're white supremacist is always mass shooting. Not quite. Doctor, please. I didn't mean to interrupt, but please.
No, that's great. Yeah, in this particular instance in 2019 at the Gilroy Garlic Festival in California, a shooter shot up, had a mass shooting there. Just before he went out, he told everyone they ought to read this book, Might is Right, which is, again, one of the worst, most vitriolic pieces of social Darwinist literature I've ever read. And I'm an expert on social Darwinism, so I've read a lot of the stuff. And this is one of the worst,
Wow.
most invective. But then this is not the only one. I mean, earlier this year, in 2022, we had a white supremacist shooting in Buffalo, New York, at a Tops grocery store. And he left a manifesto. If you read the manifesto, he makes very clear that Darwinism was an important part of his ideology, that he believed that races had evolved to different levels. He makes very clear that by the way, he makes also clear that he's not a right winger. He makes very clear, he says in this thing that he actually leans to the left politically. So there's a lot of misconceptions that people have about white supremacy. And if they'd actually read the things that these people wrote, a lot of this could be cleared up. And we realize that, hey, these are largely secular oriented individuals relying upon what they think is rational science, especially Darwinian science, to support their misguided views about racial supremacy.
What about the white supremacist groups? Are they also sort of so far left, radical left, not progressive, but radical left and tied to Darwinism and his philosophies as well? Or are they really, right, far right kind of a thing?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question, because the same question has been posed quite a bit about the Nazis in the 1930s and fascists in general. And if you look at the fascist movement in the early part of the 20th century, Mussolini, who was the earliest fascist, who named his party the Fascists, and that's where we get the name fascism from. Mussolini was a Marxist, not an orthodox Marxist, really. He was kind of Nietzschean Marxist, if you want to say that, because he sort of blended different ideas together. He loved to just power and such. But he considered himself a Marxist. He was part of the Communist Party in Italy before World War I. When he broke with them, he then formed the fascist party after World War I. And he sort of blended together different elements of the political right with the political left. So he didn't really fit very well on either side of the political spectrum. He wasn't a conservative in the sense that he wasn't trying to conserve the old order. He saw himself, in fact, as a revolutionary, and so did Hitler. They saw themselves as revolutionaries in certain ways. So they didn't really fit very well in this sort of right-left political thing that we think about. They pulled on elements of the right, they pulled on elements of the left, were very radical on both sides. And they did draw a lot of support from the political right. That is certainly true. But they really were not your typical right-wing people. And again, Mussolini and Hitler were both very secular in their orientation. They were not religious. Typically, again, Mussolini was he made his peace with the Catholic Church, but he didn't consider himself a Catholic, nor did Hitler. And the same thing is true today of a lot of these white supremacists. They don't really fit very easily on the political right or the political left. They're sort of a very radical version of sort of pulling on things from both sides, I think, in many respects, and some things that don't fit well either in the right or the left.
Have you found that any of these white supremacist groups that are around today do pull some motivation from Darwin? I mean, have you found that? Okay.
Oh, very clearly. Yeah. And again, if you look at their writings, you look at their websites, there's lots of articles about and explicitly about Darwin. I mean, this is not just something you have to read into it or something. I mean, they actually have articles about Darwin. They have articles about evolutionary ethics. They have articles about evolution of races. They have lots of articles relating to evolution. If you go to white supremacist websites, I wrote a book about Hitler's religion, and I got an email from a leader of a neo-Nazi organization, and he told me, yeah, I think you got it pretty much right. I think you pretty much interpreted Hitler right. He didn't like the fact, though, that I portrayed Hitler negatively in that book.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course. But he thought that I'd interpreted Hitler properly, actually. And in that book, I show that Hitler was a pantheist, not a Catholic or a Christian.
Right. Wow. Pantheist
meaning someone who worships nature.
Yes. Do you think that there is a if you had to characterize mass shootings, and I assume you looked at a lot of them because that last chapter you had specific instances, do you think that they're really sort of this conspiratorial, far right-wing kind of a person in general? I'm just saying in general. Or are they really more on the spectrum of Darwin, leftist, progressive? I'm just asking your opinion from what you've read and seen of the quote unquote mass shooters.
Yeah, I've investigated a number of them, especially the ones that we do know their motivations about, and ones that that embrace white nationalism and such. And it's hard to pin them on the political spectrum there. I do think that a lot of them were influenced by social media and the internet and other kinds of things with some of these groups that are white supremacist or neo-Nazi or alt-right. And again, those terms sort of overlap each other. But they do seem to be influenced by those particular groups and writings and different things like that. I'm not sure that all of these figures, I mean, like the guy in Buffalo, for example, I'm not sure all of them actually were connected in terms of having personal connections or organized connections. So I'm not sure that there's this sort of grand conspiracy in the sense that people are organizing these things necessarily, but they're encouraging them online, and people are reading this stuff online, and then they're getting the encouragement to go out and do these kind of things then.
Wow. Yeah. Again, your book is just so fascinating, brings about so many things that I think we need to understand about Darwin. One of the things that I've found interesting and quite provocative was when you mentioned Darwin, his connection to really undermining women. I mean, I write in my book, Woke Up, that, Darwin he unleashed literally sexism and misogyny in its current context. So he was a well-known sort of anthropological figure. Now, did we have women being undermined by men prior to Darwin? Certainly. Since the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, we've had all kinds of evils. But a person of his stature unleashing the idea that, well, look, I've taken a look at women, I've taken a look at their cranial formations, and clearly they don't have the intellectual capacity as men, and therefore they could be somewhat relegated. That kind of thing wasn't coming from, like you said, Darwin, which was a renowned figure at the time. That's a huge revelation, and it gives men kind of the ability to kind of subvert and undermine women and femininity and all of that, right? Or
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Darwin was giving a scientific justification for the putting down of women and not educating them, not allowing them to, thrive and such intellectually and such. And again, you're right. The thing that he pointed to scientifically was anthropological measuring of skulls, whereby women had smaller cranial capacity. Well, guess what? Women on the whole are smaller in stature and smaller in body shape and everything else. But
so
their cranial capacities are smaller. And Darwin, together with a lot of other anthropologists of his day, assumed that cranial capacity measured intellectual capacity. And that was a very wrong assumption, but that's an assumption they made. And by the way, they did the same thing with races when they when they looked at the cranial capacities, because that's another argument they made scientifically for the fact that they said the Black Africans and East Asians are inferior to Europeans, because they argued their cranial capacities were smaller. So therefore, they must have lower intelligence. But again, we've come to understand scientifically that those things don't track, that just because a person has a bigger head doesn't mean that they are more intellectually capable than someone that has a smaller head, which is what you're looking at when you're looking at cranial capacities. You're looking at the size of the head, essentially.
Right. It's just a ridiculous argument. Well, I guess in hindsight, in today's, we see this and we say, you mean you didn't take into consideration physiology? Women are just typically, their physiology is much smaller than men. Anyway. So when I take inventory over Darwin's impact on societies, and I mean global societies, I take inventory and I say he helped unleash white supremacy, racism, because when he made the distinction that, look, Blacks are subhuman, they're gorillas, they're apes, those types of things automatically elevates Europeans, Caucasians, Aryans, and diminishes Blacks as and so that one distinction, you're basically instantiating white supremacy and racism in at the same time. So I see his impact on white supremacy, racism, sexism, and misogyny. Atheism went through the roof when he started talking about evolutionary theory. A lot of people, including as I've read, Marx was really a good, came from a good Christian Protestant home. He was, I think he was Anglican or something, but he actually had some pretty profound writings when he was young. But once he got introduced to Darwin, it was over. He was just a grotesque atheist, and hated God. But you look at atheism, then you look at mass despotic genocide. So Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, all of them actually relied as at least partial justification for their actions on Darwin. And so I make that connection in my book. I use their exact quotes and how they justified doing what they did to populations, as you said, using scientific racism, scientific justification for those that are born slightly different or infirmed. They just said, look, we can exterminate people like this. Perfectly okay. Darwin said it's fine. And then, so you look at that, and then you look at eugenics. Really, Darwin, for all of the good works, he has some good scientific things that he's brought forth, especially when it related to plant life and different types of things that he did scientifically, pure scientific, without the theories. When you look at, on balance, what he unleashed, though, this guy really unleashed some, may have unleashed some great science, but he's unleashed some horrible social consequences as a result of his theories, quote unquote. Does that make sense? Am I seeing that right? Or because that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think to a large degree. I mean, the issue of Marx there, I will correct you on that one issue of Marx. Marx actually became an atheist before he knew about Darwin.
Oh, did he? Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. But you are right, though, that after Darwinism,
Wow.
atheism was going to increase all the more. And there were many people who were converted to atheism through reading Darwin. And one example I bring out in my doctoral dissertation was Karl Kautsky, who was one of the leading German socialists in the late 19th century. So he was a Marxist, but he was converted to atheism upon reading Darwin's writings and such. So there were many who were converted to atheism. That's right. And Richard Dawkins, one of the world's most famous atheists today, has said that Darwinism makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That's his terminology for it.
Wow.
So it's pretty clear that Darwinism has impacted the growth of atheism and or agnosticism to a large degree. Interestingly, Darwin himself never claimed to be an atheist, but he did claim to be an agnostic. Agnostic in the hard sense, that is, that he didn't think it was possible to know whether there's a God or not. He and many of his other followers took that position as well. But still, for all intents and purposes, that's pretty close to atheism. You're saying we can't know whether there's a God or not. So essentially, you're having to operate without there being a God under that kind of system anyway. But you're right. Darwinism was going to unleash all these things, and he was going to justify a lot of the things that were, some of which were already going on to some degree. Imperialism is one that you didn't mention that also could be mentioned in coordinating there with the racism, that he thought that imperialism was a good thing. And so he's promoting imperialism, which is another bugaboo for the woke crowd, of course.
Yeah, let me write that one down too. Yeah, keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was pretty much at a stopping point there.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is very, very illuminating. And again, I want to encourage everybody, please, you got to get this book. Dr. Weikart is a historian, and he has a brilliant scientific mind, but he went after Darwin, not to go after him personally. It wasn't about that. When you read it, you'll see that he's just trying to give us perspective, and a right, healthy, and objective perspective on Darwin and who he was. And as he began to connect the dots in the book, I mean, you'll see that racism is just kind of overflowing from the heart of Darwin. And it's just, now I also heard that Darwin actually started, he ended well, is what I heard. I heard somebody close to him tried to say that he actually converted to Christianity or gave his life to the Lord before the end of life. I don't know if that's true or if somebody just tried to.
Yeah, that's a rumor that came up quite a few decades after his death, and there's really no evidence that actually happened, unfortunately.
Yeah. It sounded to me like there was a lot of revisionist type work that was trying to be done on his behalf after he was gone to try to help smooth things over. But what Darwin, the bottom line is you have a lot of radical feminists today, a lot of them in the scientific community who are just radical, women's right, blah, blah, blah. And when you peel that onion back and you take a look at their rhetoric, and they're being shrill and hysterical about feminism, and you realize that Darwin literally unleashed during his time and gave really cover for sexism and misogyny and those types of things. These people are clearly misguided, or they don't yet understand about Darwin. So that's the other thing that I think your work is so compelling, so much needed, and it's just an incredible work. I'll give you the last word. What do you really think, now that you've written it and it's having its impact on the academic space and hopefully in the world at large, but what do you think from your perspective as the writer, what's the most, if you had to synthesize, the most compelling, the most, the thing that stuck out to you as the writer the most while writing the book, what would that be?
Well, the one thing that I hope that the reader will take away is my book does not, disprove Darwinism or anything like that, but I hope that it will make people think more carefully about the ideas coming through that are being called science. We're being told, believe the science, trust the science and stuff. Well, there's a lot of ideas out there that are called science that are misguided because they play on our prejudices. And that was not just true in the 19th century. Again, we tend to think that, oh no, we're beyond that. We don't do that anymore.
Right.
But the same thing is happening today. And, and the issues that you're pushing back on about the woke culture and such, the scientific journals are actually now promoting a lot of woke culture, even in mainstream science. And so, we're seeing similar kinds of things happening, maybe in the opposite direction, or, now it's anti-racism instead of racism. And we can be thankful that the scientists are not racist anymore, but they're now trying to promote other kinds of ideas that may or may not have any merit. Some may not, but we're being told, trust the science. So I'm wanting people to think about science critically and realize that just because something is called science in any particular era doesn't necessarily mean it's infallible, that we can challenge those ideas, and that we should look and in particular Darwinism, we should look and see if Darwinism makes sense on other levels, on scientific levels.
Yes, exactly. And that was my biggest takeaway. I just thought, this is just phenomenal work. Again, I've used you quite gratuitously in my book, Woke Up, mostly from your articles. I didn't have the book at the time. I got it sort of after, but man, it's just very, very enlightening. Again, I want to say that one more time. Please, if you're watching this, please get the book. It's Darwinian Racism. If you want to be really enlightened and awakened, you must get this book, because a lot of what's happening in the woke culture right now, what I see, Dr. Weikart, Richard, if you will, is wokeism is a Trojan horse. Okay, the Trojan horse rolls in, and then underneath that, what comes out of that, of course, would be critical race theory, intersectionality, James Cone's work with liberation theology, Black liberation theology, and all of these sort of Marxist things come out of this big Trojan horse umbrella, if you will, of wokeism. And so, but if you actually interview people who purport to be a critical race theorist, or a consultant in that space, or an anti-racist consultant, they're all in on Darwinism and Marxism.
Oh yeah.
And so it's like, well, wait a minute. How could you talk about being anti-racist and against racism, this and that and this and that? But fundamentally, you're rooted in white supremacy and racism and sexism and misogyny and elitism and imperialism and atheism. I mean, it's just it never ends. It's astounding what people are rooted in and don't even know it, and then they're projecting on everyone else. You. We live in an incredible time where we're having to endure these types of instances, but your book is going to help awaken and get people woke up. That's the point. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you again, Dr. Richard. Really, really appreciate you and the amount of work and scholarship that you have put into the studying of Darwin. There's a lot of articles as well that you guys can get that Dr. Weikart has out there, just tons of articles pointing to this, but I would encourage you, just get the book. The book is fully, it has a full encapsulation of all of the things that Darwin did and how his impacts continue to sort of exacerbate our ability to move on as a culture and unify as a culture, because we have so many of these sort of mixed metaphors about Darwin and Darwinism spread throughout. So I would encourage you, that's a fantastic read. Still, as well, get my book, Woke Up. If you really want to get woke up and enlightened and awakened, you need that book, because it connects all the dots between Darwin, Marx, Engels, and Saul Alinsky, and all the other stuff that's happening right now today is connected in that book. So I encourage you to do that. I want to thank you guys for being here. Thank you again, Dr. Weikart. Incredible scholarship. And,
thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time. God bless.